Hi everyone, this is Girish from mycloudtutorials.com, and in this video we will solve another Kubernetes challenging question. So here is the question. We have a 3-node cluster set up locally using kubeadm. We need to do the following. This is a typical kind of question that can appear in a CKAD or CKA exam. So it's asking you to create a deployment named web deploy with 3 replicas of image mycloudtutorials / poddeployservicedemo latest in namespace app1. This is a Docker image that I created just to demo how to pass environment variables to a particular pod. It's asking you to pass the following environment variables: node name, pod IP, which are the name of the node where the pod is running, name of the pod, and the IP address of the pod respectively. Verify that the pods are working fine by using curl to individual pods internal IP address. Then we have to expose this deployment as a service of type NodePort so that we can access this service from outside of our Kubernetes cluster. Once the service is created, we should just check the endpoints and try to access the node and the port URL from outside of the Kubernetes cluster. Now, in a typical exam question, they may even ask you to write these commands like curl to the IP address and the port in a particular SH or a text file, etc. But this will give you an idea about how the exam questions normally are and how they relate to the pod, the services, the deployment, and how you pass the environment variables, etc. And Kubernetes exam is an open book exam where you can access the kubernetes.io documentation, and this is exactly what we will do. So I try to use a lot of imperative commands as it gives me a quick and easy way to create the YAML files. So let's start by creating a deployment file using the imperative commands. So before that, let's just go to our terminal and see how many nodes do we have. So we have 3 nodes. Let's check the void so that we get the IP addresses as well. So this is 10, 0, 0, 10, 11, and 12. Let's take a look at if we have the namespaces. So we do not have the app1 namespace that they ask us to create. So let's create one. So I actually have an alias setup so that I don't have to type kubectl all the time. I also have an export setup so that I do not have to type the long dry run commands, but I just do it here just to show. Yeah. Okay. So let's start by creating a sample deployment configuration file. So we'll say k create deploy. Actually, before that, if it's asking you to do or create these artifacts in a particular namespace, always try to pass that in the beginning so that we don't forget. So create deploy, and the deployment name is web-deploy with 3 replicas. Okay, so web-deploy replicas equal to 3. And image is mycloudtutorials.poddeployservicedemo. Sorry. So I'll just have to type it, or maybe let's just copy it from here. As in the exam, you should be able to copy these things very easily. So what we are doing here is in the namespace app1, we are creating a deployment with the name web-deploy, where the replicas are 3, image is this, and I am going to create a YAML file rather than deploying it directly. So I'll say deploy, or let's just do the same thing, web-deploy.yaml. So if I go to web-deploy.yaml, I can see that my initial YAML file is created. Now, why I created a YAML file, not the deployment directly? Because we have to pass some environment variables, which we could not pass directly from the command line. So let's refer to the Kubernetes documentation on how to pass the environment variables in to the pods. So let's say pod environment, and here we are trying to expose pods information to the container, basically where the pod is running, what is pod's name, and what is pod's IP address. And if you look at this example, it does exactly the same. So here's my node name. My variable names are a little different, but we can copy and from here and modify it accordingly. So we'll copy the environment section and put it under the containers. So it's asking us to create 3 environment variables: node name, pod name, and pod IP. So what we have to do, we'll just change the name. Node name, pod name. I do not need the pod IP space, so remove these lines, and pod IP. So once this is set, we should be able to deploy this application, and just verify the name is set, the namespace is set, replicas are 3, and it's using the correct image. Okay, looks good. So let's say -n app1 if there are any deployments currently, and PO. Now it's a new namespace that we created, so I didn't expect it to have anything, but let's see. So let's create our deployment. K apply -f web deploy.yaml. Oh, did we? I thought we created a namespace, but let's see. Get ns. Yeah, we did not create, sorry. So let's create the namespace k create ns app1, and let's run the command again. So our deployment is created. So now we can check k-n app1, and we will get deploy and pods. So you see that our deployment is created and 3 of our pods are running as well. Let's try to get the pod's IP address. So if you see that the pod is 3 pods are running at the following, and their internal IP address are these, and they're all running on worker node 2. Let's try to access. The second part of the question says that verify that all the pods are working fine by using the curl to individual pod using pod's internal IP address. So let's try to curl and see what we get. Curl -s http, and then copy this because it's running on port 80, so you don't have to specify port 80. And here it says hello from mycloudtutorials.com. This is simple PHP pod, and details of the pod are pod running. The pod name is this, which is web deploy 497, etc. Pod's IP is this, and it's running on worker node 2. Great. Similarly, we can try the other two, 51 and 49. Now this is how we can access the pod from within our cluster, but that's not the intention. Most of the times, if you're deploying a web application, that has to be accessible from outside. So what we will do, we will expose this deployment as a NodePort service, so that on each of the nodes on a particular port, this service is accessible, or this application is accessible as a service. So that's the second part of the question, which says create a service for this deployment of type NodePort with the name web service in the namespace app1 on port 30090. So that's what we will do. So what we'll do is k-n again app1, and we'll use the imperative command expose deploy web deploy. Name of the service is, we'll just copy so that there's no typo. Type is NodePort, and this is a simple PHP container, so it's running the application on port 80. So port and target ports are both 80, and we will save this to a, let's say, web service.yaml. Open the web service.yaml, and everything is created here for us except for the node port, because there is no way to pass the node port from the command line. So we have to make sure that the node port is set up as 30090. This looks good, and then let's create the service. Okay, apply -f web service. So our service is created. So now let's take a look at the service. -f1, we will get service and the endpoints. Sorry. Get k -n app1 get svc and endpoint. Oh. Looks like the web service is created in the default namespace. We should check why it was the case. Maybe the namespace, oh yeah, so the namespace was not specified, that's why. So I'm glad that I got this error, so that we have to make sure that we specify the namespace where exactly the question is asking you to deploy. Otherwise you may end up making the same mistake in the exam. So I'm going to delete this service from the default namespace and then recreate in the desired namespace. Now let's take a look at it, the service and the endpoint. Okay, this looks good. So my service is created with an internal cluster IP address as this, and 3 endpoints belonging to the 3 pods which are exposed or created via the deployment. So this looks good. Now how do I access this from outside? So we know that we created a service as NodePort type. That means in every node in our cluster, every node of our cluster at the IP address of 30090, this service is exposing this application which has 3 pods. So let's try to access this application from outside of the cluster on the port 30090 using any one of the IP addresses of the nodes. So I will go to an IP address of the master and 30090, and yes, we are able to hit our service, and its service also act as a load balancer. So if you see that here we are hitting the IP address, the pod with the IP address 49. If I refresh, now next request is going to the pod with IP address which ends in 51. If I refresh again, it's going to 49. If you keep refreshing, at some point it will keep changing the port. So let's try to refresh again. Let's go to a different host also. So you see that it's running on all 3 of the hosts or nodes in the cluster at the particular IP address and exposing the service. So we were able to check the endpoints, and we are able to access the service on each of the node port combination of the cluster nodes. That's all for this question. I hope you liked it. Please like, subscribe, and share the channel. I'll be coming up with more Kubernetes questions, just not for the exam, but for real life scenario as well on this channel. Thank you so much. See you next time.